see the rest of them filter in, but I guess time to go ahead and get started. So the thing that I want to talk to you about today is the history of the ice business in Pekin. It's not something which we have anymore. It's something which is kind of passed into history with the development of newer technologies and the changes in the way we live. But at one time, this was one of the major industries in Pekin. So I've figured I'd gather together the information that we have available here at the library and other things that I was able to discover through some other research of my own, and put together a story for you to tell. So hopefully I will tell the story true and get in at least all the important aspects of it to give an idea of what it was like and where it went. So let's go ahead and move on from this little title page. Okay, so as I was saying, it was a big business in Pekin, so can't help. I'm a dad, so I have to do the dad jokes. A brisk business in Pekin. So, of course, an older generation, and we have a few representatives there. You would remember how this industry was once very big in Pekin. So this is before the invention of the refrigerator, before it really got caught on. Or I should say, technically, it was almost, the ice industry in Pekin was almost contemporary with the invention of the refrigerator. It did take a while for refrigeration to catch on. So when the ice business started in Pekin, they were doing it the old traditional way, like the clip I showed you from the beginning of Frozen showed that this old ways of harvesting ice, which some people in some parts of the world, the northern climes, will still do that kind of stuff. They will still have the horse-drawn snow plows and the tongs and the other implements which we'll be talking about just a short time. And so before refrigeration, if you wanted to keep your food from spoiling, one of the ways that people did it, of course, was by curing and drying your meat, creating pemmican or beef jerky, a lot of salt. And the other way was ice, to be able to preserve your food, meats and other items for long periods of time, especially during the summer months. So the long-distance transportation of food required ice-filled train cars in the 19th century. And so that was another reason why the ice business was very big at that time, with the railroads going and transporting food and things that you didn't want to spoil. You'd fill the train cars with ice. Where did the ice come from? Well, it came from the frozen rivers and lakes across the Midwest, and even beyond the Midwest. It was actually a pretty big business all around the country, and particularly in the warmer climes down in the south, they really took a hankering to Midwestern ice, so it would be shipped down to them. Confectionery businesses really took off in the 1800s. 1800s when everybody discovered this thing called ice cream. Everybody loved ice cream, well, you have to keep it from melting. So that nationwide demand for ice is what led to the rise of the ice harvesting businesses. And in Pekin, it was exceptionally profitable. This wasn't just one of the businesses. The ice business here in Pekin was quite successful. So talk a little bit about how they did it originally. So I got some information from Madison County's Illinois genealogy webpage, in which they're talking about how they would harvest ice from the Mississippi River. And not only from the Mississippi, but all kinds of rivers and lakes, as I said. So the early tools for ice cutting You'd have the axe, the pick, the scraper, the ice saw, and the breaking off bar, which is similar to a crowbar. Then after 1900, the horse-drawn ice marker and ice plow came into use. By 1918, the power field saw was introduced. Now, by the time these new developments in ice harvesting were coming along, by that time, in fact, harvested ice was beginning to taper away. It had actually been, by the end of the 1900s, that they'd already begun the shift to manufactured ice. So men gathered on the river, harvested ice for food storage. Industries such as breweries and railroads, fresh food was often shipped by rail, and private use. You know, there were a lot of homes that took a great liking to keeping their food cold or having ice for their drinks. This was labor-intensive work. The first ice houses were constructed underground. Straw was a common insulator to get the ice blocks all prepared, and they put them in underground ice houses and throw straw on them to slow down the melting process. Later they would use sawdust to prevent melting. Soon ice houses were constructed above ground because it's really hard to dig really big ice houses underground. It's easier to build them above ground. So they started building very big storage houses near the ice harvesting operation. Some wealthy residents had their own ice houses on their property. Ice harvesting provided more income for families and a much needed product. And then from Harriet Banks' history book, Pekin, a Pictorial History, from the late 1990s. So ice was cut from the Illinois River, preserved in storage houses covered with sawdust, a byproduct from cooperage houses and woodworking industries. As was delivered door to door in horse-drawn wagons. So that's an overview of how that was done. Let's take a look at this next slide I gave you. This is also from Madison County, Illinois Gen Web, a little image of the kinds of tools that they used. So you've got the ice saw. See that little, they showed that in the little clip at the beginning of Disney's movie Frozen, using the ice saw. Ice picks, ice tongs, and ice gaffs. Ice gaff is a hook. Ice fishermen still use ice gaffs. They use that to catch the fish, actually, to hook them and pull them out of there. And also to pull chunks of ice out if they needed to. So they still use ice gaffs, although they look rather different than the one shown here. So an ice pick could be used to, say, start a hole. Then you'd use the ice saw to cut the ice, and then the ice gaff to hook it and pull it out of the water. And then, of course, the ice tongs are used for lugging it to wherever you need to go, whether getting to the storage house, the ice house, a train car, and then, of course, when you're delivering it, the ice tongs are used for carrying those big blocks of ice. Okay, this is from, again, Pekin, a Pictorial History, talking about the ice boxes. So before refrigeration, kitchens were equipped with ice boxes, and customers put signs in their windows with either a 25 or a 50 facing up to indicate how many pounds of ice they needed that day. The old ice box of treasured memory was an oak affair with fancy doors and sturdy handles that would be appropriate on a ship. Sometimes, to save money, men would stop at the ice house on the way home from work. They would carry a block of ice home on the front bumpers of their cars, which were square and sturdy and commodious. I don't think even if we still had such an ice business that ice would stay on the front bumpers of our cars anymore. During the very hottest summers, as in 1936, ice did not last long, even in the insulated ice box. 1936, by the way, that summer is the summer when my mother was born. No air conditioning, all they had were these dinky little electric fans, which just, all they did was just kind of push the hot air around. This was when people were sleeping out in the parks under the trees at night because it was impossible to stay in your house. It's so incredible. It's still the hottest summer on record. And my mother said she asked my grandmother you know, because she's expecting her first child, and she's born right in the middle of that heat wave. I said, how in the world did you survive? She said, ice, a lot of ice cubes. I just was constantly chewing on ice, chewing on ice, and chewing on ice. So alternately, housewives in the winter would use a window box, utilizing outside air for cooling and freezing. It was a tin compartment that clamped into a kitchen window. Unfortunately, more often than not, the milk in the tin box, that's when it was frozen. But that was another way of doing it, instead of getting your ice from the local ice dealer. Okay, so the beginning of the ice business in Pekin, it traces back to a guy named John Lowry, our mystery man John Lowry. I tried to find a little bit more about who he was and how he came here. I know his name. I know that he set up an ice business in Pekin, and that's it. It was around the 1850s, 1860s. But he was the one who, the first man in Pekin to actually run an ice business. I don't know where he came from, don't know where he went. I wish I could have been able to provide a little bit more information about him, but he is the father of the ice business in Pekin. Nearby, across the river, Kingston, or as we call it now, Kingston Mines, is where that was the base of the Memphis Ice Company. So that was also a very big ice outfit as well, John Lowry's competition. So John Lowry and Memphis Ice Company, those two are the prehistory of Pekin's best known and longest lived ice business, the W.A. Boley Company. So I mentioned John Lowry because that leads into W.A. Boley. And now we'll talk about Mr. Boley for a little while. William Alexander Boley, or his friends called him Alec. I guess that's Mr. Boley to you and me. Pekin's King of Ice. In the 1905 History of Tazewell County by Betsy Allensworth, who compiled and edited that, he was actually continuing the 1879 History of Tazewell County of Charles C. Chapman. So in his compiling and editing that, Allensworth gathered together a bunch of biographies of local notable men and women, mostly men of course, but because of the time. But there were some notable women who he was very kind enough to mention as well. So there's a biography of W.A. Boley, William Alexander Boley, deceased, because by 1905 he passed away, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, January 5th, 1832, the son of Daniel and Ruth I. Crawford Boley. His father is of German lineage, so this is my little note I added here, the German name Bola, or Boley, in Ostfriesland, in the area of the northwestern area of Germany, and even other parts of Germany, but especially there you'll find a lot of men with the name of Boley. And that's where that name came from. So his last name essentially signifies that they're descended from some German guy back in Germany whose name was Boley, which became, what does the name mean? It means dude. It was one of the words that the Germans gave for a guy. And it became a popular name for a boy. So, because I guess they liked the sound of it. So for generations, his family is identified with Pennsylvania history. So he's one of the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch, or Deutsch. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all being natives of Pennsylvania. William Alexander Boley was reared in his native state of Pennsylvania, received a common school and academic education, and after the death of his father in 1847, he assumed the management of the coal business, which he sold out a year later. Coal, okay? Whenever you're looking at ice businesses, you're oftentimes going to find it in connection with coal. I'm not sure how that worked out, but oftentimes there would be similar, you could kind of harness the two kinds of industry together, and you'd need trains to ship the ice, you'd need trains to ship the coal. Similar kind of work. The underground ice houses. You're digging an underground ice house, you dig a coal mine. So similar skills are involved there. So his father had a coal business back in Pennsylvania. Father died in 1847, and W.A. Boley took that business over, but he sold it out after a year, just a year later, and then he got on a steamboat on the Ohio River. He got into steamboating because he didn't like coal, at least not that at that point in his life. So for the first 3 weeks, he was a watchman on the steamboat, then promoted to second mate, 5 months later to first mate. In the latter capacity, he continued for 3 years doing duty on boats on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers between Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Now these are things that are going to prepare him for the business he's going to be getting into, because this is how he's becoming familiar with the arteries of trade in the United States at that time. Continuing his biography, he next became superintendent of the Memphis Ice Company at Kingston. So he's ended up coming up down the Ohio, he's going up and down the Mississippi, comes up to Illinois, and now he's at Kingston. He becomes superintendent of Memphis Ice Company. So this is how he gets his start in the ice business. In its day, this was one of the most prominent concerns of its kind in the state, owning and operating 13 barges besides a number of towboats. He needed that in order to ship the ice down to those who wanted it. In 1860, Mr. Boley came to Pekin, and there accepted a position as superintendent for John Lowry, which position he retained 6 years when he purchased the entire business. So 1866, he is the owner of John Lowry's old business. In 1888, the concern was incorporated under the name of the W.A. Boley Ice Company with a typo there, with a capital stock of $32,000, of which Mr. Boley was made the president and general manager. So he's now the CEO of his own company. So this is how he gets a start, working in his father's coal mines in Pennsylvania, steamboating along the Ohio and Mississippi. Now he's come to the Pekin and Peoria area, and he's gotten into the ice business. And so he knows about boats, he knows about the rivers, he knows about digging, and he knows how to work. And now he has bought out his boss, John Lowry, who for whatever reason wanted to leave the business. Again, I don't know what happened to Mr. Lowry that he didn't want to be in the ice business anymore, but he sold the business to his superintendent. Okay. And now, oops, a little bit too far. From his 1895 newspaper obituary, there's a few more details here. So in 1855, he was offered the superintendency of the Memphis Ice Company of Kingston, Illinois, and accepted it. From that day to this, he has been identified with the ice industry. In 1860, he became the superintendent for John Lowry, and a few years later, purchased the business he has since conducted, enlarging it and spreading it until today. This is 1895, at the time of his death. The Boley Ice Company is known far and wide. 7 years ago, the concern was incorporated with a capital stock of $32,000, Mr. Boley becoming president and manager. His obituary was later used by Mr. Allensworth in the biography of W.A. Boley. That's why there's similar language in telling a lot of the same story. Then in the 1974 Pekin sesquicentennial, this is what it mentions here. The ice was shipped down the river on large barges. Pekin Lake's shore was literally lined with ice houses. This is telling us where the ice business was. W.A. Boley was doing his ice harvesting along Pekin Lake, which is a little backwash of the Illinois River. These ice houses were built along Gravel Ridge. They were huge affairs capable of holding some 20,000 tons each. All were owned by the W.A. Boley Ice Company Incorporated, who had purchased the business from John Lowry in 1866. 7 years later, the Boley Company bought the lake for $5,000, bought the whole lake, and it retained the exclusive rights through the Otto Cook estate until the early 1950s. So Pekin Lake was not public land. It was actually private property. It was owned by the Boley Company, and then later by the Otto Cook estate. Gravel Ridge, that area along Pekin Lake, of course, we have a railroad going along there. That railroad was there at that time, and that's, of course, how they used, that's what the Boley company was able to use to get their ice out of Pekin Lake from the storage houses, from the ice houses, and then through side tracks, get it on board the train and send it wherever it needs to go that way. The other way, of course, was to get it to barges. Okay, and finally, this little thing here. One final excerpt from Boley's biography. The houses which were owned by the company were situated on Pekin Lake and had a capacity of 35,000 tons. Now, the sesquicentennial said 20,000. This is 35,000. The houses are gone. I have no idea how much ice they could really hold. I just wanted to note the contradiction between the 1905 biography and the 1974 sesquicentennial. So by means of side tracks, the ice could be loaded in cars and shipped to various points throughout the state. This is something that's quite significant, because Boley was started out in Pekin, based in Pekin, but did not stay only in Pekin. All right, this is a image that I got from the 1870-71 Sellers and Bays Pekin City Directory, page 15. So, 1870-71, Boley, W.A., ice dealer, resident southwest corner of 2nd and Henrietta, which is actually not terribly far from where his business was located. And if you look in that city directory for other ice dealers, you won't find any. He was it. In 1870-71, he was Pekin's only ice dealer. All right, 6 years later, about 5 or 6 years after that city directory, we have this notice in the Tazewell Republican newspaper, the 30th of June, 1876. I'll just read this whole thing to you. Boley's New Grays are a nice team. These are the horses that are being used to pull these wagons full of ice. Boley's New Grays are a nice team, and they don't propose to be run over by anybody's locomotive. Yesterday, while Mr. Boley's teamster was loading ice into a car on the track near the Union Depot, an engine came running by, frightened the horses, and away they started. Mr. Charlton, the driver, tried to get on the step at the rear end of the ice wagon where the reins were tied, but missed his footing and fell. The horses ran about 2 blocks. The ice bobbed up and down and played a lively game of roly-boly, and when the concern was stopped, it was ascertained that the damage was a broken tongue and a damaged wheel. Now, this is interesting because it kind of gives you just this little glimpse into the activity of the business at that time. You can see how they're using the wagons to load the ice and everything. But it's also talking about being near the Union Depot. The wagon needs to get the ice on over to where the train was. So apparently they didn't have a sidetrack at that time, or at least they didn't have a sidetrack to that particular depot. But then we mentioned this Mr. Charlton, the driver. I highlighted his name for a reason. Let's take a look next. Okay. That same year, the 1876 Pekin City Directory, pages 6 and 9. We look over here. There's William A. Boley, ice merchant, residence northwest corner of Alton and Chestnut. We don't have an Alton anymore, and I'm not sure which street that is today. But we also have a D. Crawford Boley, ice merchant, residence northeast corner of New Hall in Illinois. New Hall is also something we don't have anymore, I don't believe. D. Crawford Boley and William A. Boley. Think they might be related? You're right. Brothers. D. Crawford, do you remember the biography was referring to William A. Boley's father named Daniel, and his mother's name, her maiden name was Crawford. D. Crawford Boley. Daniel Crawford Boley was William Boley's baby brother. William was the firstborn in the family, and D. Crawford was the last child in the family. Family, if I remember, I believe they had about 12 kids in the family. And so he has come now and joined his brother in Pekin, and is working as an ice merchant. In fact, he was clerking in his big brother's business, kind of taking care of clerical duties and taking care of the books. And then we look up here, same year, 1876, looking for Charlton. There's a Charles Charlton, Broadway opposite Colt. Okay, this is that Mr. Charlton, who was the driver in that story. He's the only possible one, and we'll find out in just a moment how we know that Charles Charlton is the Mr. Charlton of that story. A little too far. A lot too far. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Yeah, that is okay. So this image was reproduced in the 1974 Pekin Sesquicentennial, and this photo was from the early 1900s, and it shows the Bowley Icehouses in the background and the Bowley Icemen using horse-drawn ice markers and ice plows. Remember those things that were mentioned earlier? So by this time they're doing horse-drawn instead of having to just do it, walking out on the ice yourself. So that's an image of the Bowley operation. You see how big those ice houses could get. And here's another picture of the ice houses. This was reproduced in Pekin, a pictorial history. And this is right on the shores of Pekin Lake. You notice that there's not too much snow and the water's not frozen, so this was not taken during the coldest of the winter months. Okay, look at this. Bowley gets a competitor. Remember, Bowley was the only ice business in town. Pekin Daily Times, the 30th April 1885, they had this big story in which they're kind of doing what in the newspaper business has been called a progress edition, which is basically free advertising for all the local businesses, where they're doing stories that feature local businesses and help to promote them. A way of rewarding the local businesses for buying advertising in the paper. So that every year you'd have this special story in which you talk about local businesses. And the Pekin Times, for some reason, didn't want to mention the W.A. Bowley Ice Company, but they wanted to mention this guy here. And they mentioned an ice merchant. One of our most enterprising businessmen is named Mr. Charles A. Charlton. See, Charles Charlton, I was telling you. He's in the ice business. He conducts a general ice business, and we are pleased to state that business is booming with him. The present prospects are unusually bright for a splendid summer trade. His ice house is on East Court Street, and it is packed with the finest quality of frozen goods harvested from Bailey's Lake, which is made up entirely of spring water. The ice is therefore as clear as crystal. The quality is superior to any other gathered. Take that, W.A. Bowley. Mr. Charlton does a wholesale business in central Illinois as well as the largest retail trade in the city. All orders left at his downtown office will receive prompt attention. Okay, so this little story letting us know about this new business that Mr. Charles A. Charlton has begun. He was a driver for W.A. Bowley, and just as Mr. Bowley started out working for Mr. Lowry, Mr. Charlton started out working for Mr. Bowley. And now he's gone out on his own, and he's starting a rival ice business, and he can't use Pekin Lake. He goes to Bailey's Lake, which is today called Lake Arlen, also known as Myers Lake. I'm not sure if they've made up their mind what they call that lake yet, but originally in those days it was called Bailey's Lake. And so it's made up entirely of spring water, unlike that Illinois River backwash. Now, it's very interesting that ice harvesting got started in the industrial age, when we were starting to build factories and refineries and distilleries all along our rivers, and dumping our sewage and industrial waste right into the river, and then that water would freeze in the winter, we'd carve it all up and we'd put it in our drinks. We'd make ice cream out of it. Well, people started noticing that there's stuff in the ice. And Pekin Lake, you know, being a backwash, it doesn't always get terribly deep. So people started getting worried, I want some better looking ice here. So the ice from Bailey's Lake was actually better quality. So Mrs. Charlton started giving Mr. Boley a run for his money. Okay, so growth and change. Manufactured ice. Manufactured ice. The ancient way of harvesting ice, people, of course, in the 1800s were wanting, well, can we build a machine for that? Why do we have to do it this way? Maybe if we can find a way to manufacture ice, freeze the water outside of our polluted rivers and lakes, maybe we can have some really good ice and not worry about what's melting into our drinks and what our ice cream is made of. Why is my ice cream so chewy? This actually began in 1845. Sorry, not 1845, 1851, sorry. 1851. The 6th of May, 1851, some guy from Florida, a Florida man named John Gorey, MD, he's a doctor, okay? He got the first U.S. patent number 8080, because he had built this contraption called a mechanical refrigerator. So it's the first ice machine. Now he built it actually in 1845. He got the patent in 1851. So he's actually the inventor of the ice machine and refrigerator and freezers. That all came from him. He was the first one to figure out all the chemical stuff you need to do to get water to freeze without having to wait for Mother Nature to do it for you. So he's considered the father of air conditioning, mechanical refrigeration, but he was ridiculed in his lifetime. What? You want us to go and use this artificial, who knows what that really is coming out of that machine? Ugh. You know, machines and assembly line kind of stuff. You want us to have artificial ice? No way, I'm putting that in my mouth. No way. It took a while for it to catch on. So that's why throughout the 1800s, ice harvesting, the ancient way, continued. It really took till toward the end of the 1900s for people to get used to the idea of manufactured ice. But we can owe it all to John Gorey for eventually putting all of Pekin's ice businesses out of business. What he got started. So there's an article I found from the Bloomington Paragraph about 7 or 8 years ago. Bill Kemp, who's the archivist and historian for the McLean County Museum of History, out east of us, he wrote this very interesting article called Ice Cutters Harvested Crystal Treasure from Lakes and Ponds. So he talks about the one they have over there in the Bloomington area. They had an ice company called Monroe Brothers. In late 1882, Monroe Brothers sold their business, including the ice cutting surface of a mill pond near Kappa, to the W.A. Boley Ice Company of Pekin, a large concern with operations in St. Louis and Evansville. So remember what I mentioned? It started in Pekin, but Boley didn't just stay in Pekin. That's how successful he was. He was buying up other people's ice operations, and he was setting up ice houses and transportation depots all around the state. So Evansville, St. Louis, Pekin, Bloomington. By the 1880s, the natural ice industry was finding it increasingly difficult to compete against the newly developed industrial process of manufactured ice. Unaffected by the vagaries of wintertime freeze and thaw patterns, factory-made ice was also seen as a sanitary alternative to a supply too often culled from the polluted waters of industrial age America. Not incidentally, Bloomington's first manufactured ice plant opened sometime in the early 1890s. And that was also the period when Pekin's ice dealers started adding, on the side of their old ice harvesting, started adding manufactured ice. It was around that time, late 1800s, early 1900s, that start to see that shift. Even so, the natural ice was still harvested locally on a commercial scale for another decade or more. And he's talking about McLean County. I think it lasted a bit longer here at Pekin just because we had Bowley right here. The ice cutters are busily engaged in cutting, hauling, and storing away their crystal treasures, noted the pantograph on January 2nd, 1893. Natural ice is largely used yet, especially by butchers, brewers, and other persons, or establishments make use of large quantities. The manufactured ice was limited by, energy, the process. The machine could only make so much ice and had to be, recharged. Whereas if it's winter time, everything's frozen over, you got plenty of ice, a lot more than you can get out of the machines at that time. So that's why it was able to carry on for a bit longer. All right, 1887, here's the Pekin City Directory, page 105. It lists only 2 ice dealers in town. There's one on Pekin Lake and one on Bailey's Lake. Look at that, there's W.A. Bowley, 216 Court Street. And there's Charles A. Charlton, 225 Court Street. Okay, look at that, only 2. There's Mr. Charlton, still competing with W.A. Bowley. And then we can take a look at, 1893. Remember that article from the pantograph we mentioned was from 1893, talking about the people doing the ice harvesting. Ice harvesting is still really big. You look at the 1893 Pekin City Directory, we find that Charlton has left the business. But this guy named Curran has joined. So Charlton's business may have been doing well for a short time, but Bowley had the leg up. He was bigger and stronger, he had more money, and he was actually able to outcompete Charlton, who was mainly local. Charlton couldn't break out of Pekin, whereas Bowley was already outside of Pekin. So he's run Mr. Charles Charlton out of business, and by 1893, he is a police officer. Policeman, 802 Park Avenue. So he's definitely changed his line of work. He's no longer harvesting ice and selling it, and he's now enforcing the law, okay? And then by 1895, he's actually Pekin's chief of police. I guess he did a lot better at being a constable than he did at harvesting ice. Okay, the 1893 Bates City Directory shows that Bowley had a new competitor, William A. Curran, president of Pekin Loan and Homestead Association. And so we see that right here. Pekin Lake Ice Company, William R. Curran, president. And here he is down here listed, the Pekin Loan and Homestead Association. William R. Curran. He first come to the county a few years back, before this time. We find him down in the Green Valley, Delavan area. But then he ends up moving to Pekin. Somehow he ends up ice. He's an attorney and now he's got ice. And this is Pekin Lake Ice Company. Well, wait a minute. Bowley's on Pekin Lake. You think he's going to let somebody else set up a... Well, this is a deceptive name for his company. He's trying to trick people. Because Pekin Lake is Bowley. So he's decided to give a company this name of... It's actually lake ice, Bailey's Lake, and it's in Pekin. So it's a Pekin Lake. But it sounds like Pekin Lake. So he's actually trying to... Basically, he's infringing on Bowley's trademark, so to speak. I'm not sure if it was trademarked, but that's essentially what that is. It's he's kind of an underhanded way of trying to promote your business. And he's an attorney, and basically, so he's actually down at Bailey's Lake. Charlton was the one who had his business there. His business went belly up, and Curran basically took it over. However he did it, I don't have the details, but perhaps it went into receivership and Curran was the attorney responsible for it, and he just decided to run it for a while. Okay, and we go. So we're in the 1890s, and I previously mentioned how we got the obituary of W. A. Boley in 1895. So yes, W. A. Boley is dead. Boley's competitor William R. Curran's stint as an ice merchant was even shorter than Charlton's. By 1895, the Bait City directory shows that W. A. Boley Ice Company Pekin is Pekin's only ice dealer. So we're back to just one again. However, that same year, Boley passed away. And this is an excerpt from his newspaper obituaries, probably from the Pekin Daily Times, we're not sure. The clipping actually was saved by a woman, I think, in the Green Valley area, and then her scrapbooks were then donated to the Tasman County Historical and Genealogical Society. So she didn't write down which newspaper she clipped it out of. It was probably the Pekin Daily Times, because that was, by that time, the major Pekin paper. It wasn't the only Pekin paper, but it was the major one by that time. So born January 5th, 1832, died February 13th, 1895 at his home in the city. Age 63, 1 month and 8 days, came the end of a busy and useful life. The sickness, which yesterday resulted in death, is of long standing. Now this is one of the big differences between obituaries today and obituaries back then. Obituaries back then like to mention how you died. Sometimes it's morbidly and gruesomely graphic. They like to mention how you died. Obituaries today, you just waft off on angel wings. You go home to Jesus. But they don't mention, well, what did he die of? They don't want to mention that. Sometimes people don't want to mention what they die of. That's understandable. Here, they didn't mind mentioning what Mr. Boley died of. Hope you don't have weak stomachs. So for years he has been a martyr to stomach trouble. Sickness, which yesterday resulted in death, is of long standing. Stomach trouble. Suffering frequent attacks that would confine him to bed for several days at a time. The last attack came on about 10 days ago in the form of a hemorrhage of the stomach. His condition at once became alarming. This was followed by other hemorrhages until at last, worn out and weakened beyond further endurance, he closed his eyes in eternal sleep and passed peacefully away to that mysterious bourne from whence no traveler ever returns. Right? When it's my time, I want somebody to write something like that about. So he might have had stomach cancer, ulcers, who knows what it was, but it got bad until finally. 63, that's young by today's standards, but that was pretty average for that time and place. Yes, W. A. Boley, the dutiful husband, the kind father, the faithful friend, is dead. But the memory of his kindly deeds, his open hand and charity, will live long years to come. No man was more generous than Alec Boley. No man performed more acts of practical Christianity than Alec Boley. His heart was as big and as full of kindness and tenderness as beats in the bosom of any man, and the poor whom he had befriended will not soon forget him. He was a man of deeds, not of words, and preferred to keep his kindly acts in the background rather than let them be known. So, very fine tribute to him. So this is a way of saying that he was a big guy in the town. Everybody knew him. He was well loved, and he did for being a German Methodist. He was very serious about his faith as well. So if you were going to be a prominent man in town in those days, you're definitely going to be a churchgoer. And so he did what he could to put his faith into practice. But now he's gone. Now what happens? What's going to become of his business that he built and all of his ice houses? Lewis Grant and his 4 sons enter the ice biz. Okay. The father, the king of Pekin's king of ice, is dead. And now the race is on to find out who's going to get the crown. After Boley's death in 1895, his vice president and manager, Otto Cook, took over as president and general manager. But by 1898, the directory shows new competitors, Lewis Grant and his sons, coal miners on the bluffs of Bailey's Lake, successors of Charlton and Curran. So, that's the other big place in Pekin to do ice harvesting is Bailey's Lake. And now Grant, Lewis Grant and his sons are going to be competitors. So your W. A. Boley Ice Company Incorporated. So this is actually a corporation, not just some local business. Otto Cook, President and Treasurer. Dr. S.D. Lowe, Secretary, 510 Court. And here's his widow, Mrs. Anna, and his daughter, Miss Louisa. W.A. Boley and Anna only had one child. They were only able to have one kid, and that was Louisa. And she did marry and have children. I believe she has living descendants. And then, of course, we have L. Grant and Sons, coal miners and dealers in ice on the East Bluff. Pekin's East Bluff. Sons, William David Lewis and Peter Grant. And here they're listed as well. 1316 Court Street. That was far out on the east end of Pekin in those days. Not anymore, but so these are coal miners. Remember that connection between coal and ice? They're digging coal out of the East Bluff near Bailey's Lake. They've got a side track, and they've also decided to take over the ice business that Charlton and Curran had been running there. They're going to go and have two operations here going on, coal and ice. Boley versus Grant Brothers, 1903. They were formidable competitors of Boley because they could rely on their coal mining income to tide them over from winter to winter. So when you can't, if you can't rely solely on the income from ice, if it's not as good a winter, that kind of thing, they could, like I said, they supplemented their income because they were also making money mining and selling coal. So this is the 1903 directory, and it mentions the two ice companies. Grant Brothers, because Lewis, the father, had died, so that was Grant Brothers, and W.A. Ice Company, W.A. Boley Ice Company, Otto Cook. And now H.B. Cook is the vice president and manager, and W.E. Sherman is the secretary. And here's some maps. Shows you their ice operations. This is from the 1910 Tazewell County Atlas and Plat map. And we can see this representation of Pekin Lake. And all this area is owned by the W.A. Boley Ice Company. And here it says Ice House. Here's Lucinda and Amanda. There's Harriet. So all along Gravel Ridge, they had ice houses up here. And over here is Bailey's Lake. The Grant Mine along the side of Bailey's Lake. This, of course, is where we have the stadium now for the high school. And here is the Grant's Switch. This is their side track going up to the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad. And they used it not only for their coal, but also for their ice. One little thing here, Artificial Ice Company. It doesn't say W.A. Boley Ice Company, it says Artificial Ice Company. And we know by this time, by 1910, this whole area was owned by Boley. So this has to be another kind of branch of Boley. So they're doing artificial ice as well. They've actually set up a factory with ice machines to generate ice, in addition to harvesting it from Pekin Lake. Okay, that photo that we had, that little title page that I gave it here, that's that photo. This is the Grant Brothers Ice House on Bailey Lake. So the Schaefer-McNally family collection is where this photo comes from. Schaefer, the same family that where we get the name Schaeferville, because that's also in that same general area. Judge Charles Schaefer, if I remember right, was the one who ended up taking over the Grant Brothers operation later on, the coal mining operation later on. See how big those things could get? The blocks of ice they've got there, they got a whole, you can kind of see a bunch of them stacked here. Looks like Not sure if those are kind of ice gaff or ice picks that they're using to pull the blocks around. And here's another photo of the Grant Brothers operation. It's one thing to see something on the map with a little railroad track and everything. It's another thing to actually see. Now, this is what it looked like. Here they are loading the blocks onto the Santa Fe railroad cars. And these, again, these would be shipped to places all over the Midwest and even down into the South. St. Louis was the big distribution area. You'd get it down to St. Louis, and then from St. Louis they would ship it all over the South. So this is how the 1974 Pekin Sesquicentennial describes the Grant Brothers ice business. During the height of the season, it is reported that the Grant Company employed as many as 300 men to cut and load the ice. As many as 5 boxcars per day were loaded by hand, and the cakes of ice weighed as much as 170 pounds each. Big, strong guys lugging those things. Ice could be stored for as long as 2 years through a process which involved packing the frozen ice in straw and sawdust. Remember that? Can you imagine the ice being able to last for 2 years through summers? When ice was taken from the storage houses for delivery to homes and businesses in the summer months, it had to be sawed and chiseled into 25, 50, and 100-pound cakes. Customers would have a card in the front window, remember that one mentioning of 25 and 50, indicating to the delivery man how much, if any, ice was needed. Children used to follow the iceman around as if he were the Pied Piper, hoping to catch him in a generous mood and have him give them a small piece. It may have been a far cry from air conditioning, but it was a great way to cool off on a hot day before 1930. Okay. Oops. Hold on. All right. So there's this article that appeared in the Idaho Statesman, the 29th of May, 1911. 2 boys killed by a tornado in Illinois. Storm strikes Pekin and causes property loss of thousands of dollars. Tornado hitting Pekin. Wow. Oh boy. So the date line is Peoria, Illinois, May 28th. A tornado struck Pekin, Illinois, 10 miles south of here, that is south of Peoria. At 1 o'clock this afternoon, killing 2 persons and causing property damage that will amount to thousands. The dead, Clyde Sakers, age 14, and Frank Woodley, age 50. The storm came from the southwest, as it always does, demolishing the pumping station on the east bank of the Illinois River. It then jumped across the Illinois River, and the plants of the Baylor Ice Company were completely demolished. The residence portion of the city escaped. Wire communications of all kinds are demolished. This is bad. Baylor's been around since 1866, and now tornado flattens them. So what do? Well, insurance, do what you can, rebuild. So they rebuild and they carry on for a little while longer. That was 1911. 1922, 11 years later, fire destroys Icehouses, a bowling company. Ow! Bowling auto cook must have been thinking, Mother Nature, leave me alone! Icehouses of the Baylor Ice Company were totally destroyed by a disastrous fire last evening about 6 o'clock. The houses were what are known as the lower houses, and there was no ice in them. They didn't lose any ice, but still. It is believed that the fire was started by sparks from a train, and it gained great headway before an alarm was turned in. The 20th of October, still warm enough and dry enough for sparks from a train to set fire to your ice house. The fire department had just returned from a small fire in the neighborhood of the Sugar Works, the old sugar house. And fire out had just been tapped when the ice house alarm came in. The department was handicapped by the great headway the blaze had attained before their arrival, and there was no hope of saving the structure. The fire spread rapidly, the huge flames which leaped into the air being plainly seen for miles. 1 or 2 residences across the track from the burning buildings were slightly scorched, and a great throng was attracted to the fire. The Baylor Company will suffer a heavy loss, the insurance on the buildings being sufficient to only partially cover it. 1911 and 1922. Okay. That's going to hurt. It's going to hurt their bottom line, having to rebuild twice.
Their insurance got canceled.
Here is something from the 1934 Pekin City Directory. This is the height of the Great Depression now. W.A. Boley Ice Company had moved on from simple ice harvesting to the manufacture of artificial ice, remember that? In addition, Boley supplied coal to residences and even sold alcoholic beverages on the side. So they got rid of Prohibition, you know, remember that? And now after Prohibition, they need money. So they're going to start selling some booze too. This is not good. So the 230 Fayette is where they got their big storage house there. Phone 61, Pekin, Illinois. Now notice it says since 1864, they're off by 2 years. I don't know if that was a mistake of the person who submitted the ad or the person who printed the ad, but it's actually 1866 when it started. So notice they're doing coal, they're doing ice, and they're doing liquor. So Boley's final competitor now is the C. Stark and Son Ice Company that arrived on the scene in 1932. First shows up in the Pekin City Directories in 1932. And here we are in 34, we got this ad here. Their offices were at 304 Margaret, but by 1937, Boley had gone out of business. Hit twice in the early 1900s, and then finally they couldn't make it through the Great Depression. That's what finished off Boley. Didn't finish off the ice business in Pekin, but it finished off the biggest concern. Because remember, Boley is located not just in Pekin. Remember, they've got outposts all over Illinois. So that's how bad things have gotten. Their business goes under. And in Pekin, Stark is left. Stark moves into Boley's storage house at 230 Fayette, while also running their site at 304 Illinois. Okay, so end of an era, Boley hands the baton to Stark. Even after the demise of the W.A. Boley Ice Company, the ownership of Pekin Lake remained with Otto Cook and his heirs until the early 1950s. Afterwards, the 1974 Pekin Sesquicentennial mentions it was purchased by the Forest Park Foundation, who donated it to the state for recreational purposes. And that brings us to its current status. C. Stark and Son Ice Company would prove to be Pekin's last ice dealer, supplying ice to residences from the 1930s into the early 1950s. Stark was Chris Stark, and Son was Carl Stark. In the early 1940s, the company's manager was Oscar C. Curtis. Among their icemen were John Urish and Oscar Jackson. Another of the Stark icemen was Elwood Woody Lawson, who hired on at age 17 and learned the ropes of ice work from Urish. And just for those who will be watching this video, we have members of Woody Lawson's family here with us. I'm glad they came. Thank you. All right, so here's a photo. Oh, come on, just keep getting ahead of myself here. There we go. So Linda Urish-Remus, John Urish's daughter, brought in some photos for me within the last year or so. And this is one of the photos, and the one guy in the middle is her father, John. She didn't know the names of the other guys, but so this is when they were working for Stark and Son in Pekin. And John, she said her father later went on to work for Pekin Dairy, then the ABC Washing Machine Company. And she doesn't know who this guy is, but this shows the truck. So it's a C. Stark and Son. Although it looks a little bit more like G. Stark, but we know that the father and son had names beginning with the letter C. So C. Stark and Son, distributor. So he's got his ice on his back there. All right. So we get to wrap it up now. There's your dad. Stark Ice Company went out of business around 1943 due to a fire caused by welding torches during renovation work on the business. The fire destroyed their building on Illinois Street, and the Stark family then sold their business to the Peoria Ice Company. World War II was raging during those years. Several of the former Stark Icemen went off to fight, including young Woody Lawson. He joined the Marines. After the war, Lawson again found work as an iceman in Pekin, this time with city coal and ice. So this is somebody who's distributing ice, and this would be artificial. We're not talking, ice harvesting is done. Nobody's harvesting ice anymore. That really ended with the fires that destroyed Bowley's ice houses. When Bowley went, there really wasn't any more ice harvesting going on. But the increasing popularity and affordability of the refrigerator around the middle of the 20th century soon put an end to the old ice industry. In the 1950s, Lawson ended his years in the ice industry with a distinction in local history, being Pekin's last residential ice delivery man. And this photo was provided by his widow, Darla. This is from 1952, and out in front of 821 Caroline Street in Pekin. So I just wanted to end it with the guy who finished it off for us, with Woody Lawson. And of course, a lot of people in town still remember him from, he did run a tavern, I believe, right? Woody's Tavern.
Yeah.
And also sold bait, right?
And Lawson's Bait and Tackle.
Yeah, Lawson's Bait and Tackle. So he went on to do other things as well. Of course, I know he worked at Keystone for a bit.
Yeah.
But that's what he got to do originally. He used to bring the ice cream.
Those blocks of ice, you'd have to carry them upstairs because so many people lived on second level apartments.
Wow.
And when he went in the Marine Corps, he said these guys were belly aching when they were carrying their rifles and stuff. And Dad said, I didn't think they were heavy. He said, because I've been loading ice all my life.
Of course, yeah. That's a good way to prepare. Carry your packing gear during the war. Wow. So, anyway, that's the story. Changes in technology, and then Mother Nature didn't cooperate. God decided to smite Bowley with tornado and fire, and then the Great Depression came along and finished him off. But that's, like I said, that's the story about this big business in town and where it went. Now, of course, we still have ice companies distributing ice in Pekin. We got those machines at the stores, and we got the little coolers. You can buy bags of ice. Down on Derby, there's a machine where you can drive up to and put your stuff out and put your cooler in front of it, put in your money, and the ice machine gives you the ice. So we still have ice in Pekin. It's just, it's all manufactured now. And again, considering the many decades, really almost 2 centuries of dumping who knows what into our water supply, it's probably just as well. I don't think anybody wants to have natural ice from our area any longer. So it really wouldn't be worth it to even try to run a business that way here. But anyway, so that tells you, like I said, that there's the story, and I am very glad you came to hear it. It was very interesting for me to gather together the photos and the other materials and present this for you. And I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. A little piece of Pekin's history that we can always bring back and think about and remember from time to time. It's even though it's been decades gone, that was very influential. A lot of men in this town, it was the way they got their work, they got their money, their pay. Most of them working for Bowley, occasionally working for men like Charlton and Curran, and working for the Grant brothers. So it had big influence locally, and even beyond Pekin's borders, far beyond Pekin's borders. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was fun.